Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to tempo correction or timing correction in Cubase. This is really a kind of a catch-all phrase that's primarily going to deal with AudioWarp. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at that today. But as you'll also see, we can consider timing correction in terms of quantizing. We can quantize audio in just the same way that we can MIDI. And we're also going to have a little bit of a look under the hood to examine hit points. That's another really important concept in Cubase. Hope you enjoyed this one today. Check out the Patreon and channel member links below if you'd like to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Now, before we make a start today, I need to place a huge caveat on this entire conversation. Audio timing correction is an intensely personal and subjective decision. In fact, the audio correction that we're going to do today is on a song that I've already published, and I didn't do any audio correction on it at all. When I released the piece, I liked the way the solo sounded, this little phrase that we're going to listen to here, and so I left it completely alone as originally recorded, as performed. In preparation for this video, I've thought to myself, you know what, there are a couple of phrases here that I really should have gone in and done that due diligence. If I'd looked at how far away they were from proper timing, maybe I would have done a little bit of correction on them. And that's probably my bad. I think I was probably slightly more lazy than kind of creatively inspired when making that decision. But it's a really important thing for you to consider. Don't just quantize audio straight to the grid. That's almost always going to be a bad idea because you're losing a lot of that kind of individuality and humanity when you do so. This is something that you need to do very carefully. Having said that, today we're going to do it fairly scientifically because I'm going to show you the concept of audio timing, and then you decide how much of this you're going to apply to your own music. So with all of my excuses and caveats out of the way, let's listen to a short section of this solo so that we have some context of what we're going to be doing today, and then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty. You can hear quite clearly the solo isn't in strict time. I'm actually playing with the time quite a bit, probably too much, but I've already slapped myself on the wrist, so let's move on. We're going to open this audio in the lower editor. I do the vast majority of my timing correction from the lower editor. The first thing for us to have a look at, and we're just going to dip very briefly into this subject because it's an absolute minefield, is hit points. On the left-hand inspector, let's open our hit points section. Can you see all of these vertical lines in the audio event with the tiny triangles at the top? They are hit points, and they've been generated automatically. Cubase has done this without me doing a single thing. If you have a look in your edit preferences options in editing audio, then there's an option here that says enable automatic hit point detection. I have that enabled. So every time new audio hits my project, whether I've recorded it or dragged it in from a WAV file or wherever, Cubase is going to do this automatically. It's going to create these hit points. Just to show you how dynamic they are, I'm going to throw them all away. We can say remove all hit points, and they've all gone. So now Cubase has no idea at all about the timing of this piece of audio. If I pressed quantize, it simply wouldn't know what to do. In fact, let's do it. I'll press Q. No changes are made to the audio whatsoever. It's the hit points that allow Cubase to figure out how to move these various audio moments to the bar or the beat or whatever it's trying to do. Having deleted all of the hit points, it's equally easy to recreate them all. We simply enable edit hit points and they all come back again. Now these vertical lines are algorithmically based. In other words, Cubase can work out dynamically what we want to do with them. Let's zoom in on this little section of audio here. This is where I'm doing my chug-a-lugs. Let's have a quick listen to it. Okay, now they kind of strictly, technically speaking, want to be on these 16th points. But can you see that one of them is missing? This little audio section down here doesn't have a vertical line. That's because the threshold value, currently set at 7%, is not sufficiently sensitive to pick up the size of that transient. If I change the threshold, suddenly I'm going to pick up that extra little stop. And so this is giving you a good idea of just how dynamically these hit points are being created and removed. It's entirely dependent on the sensitivity levels that we set inside our project as to which ones Cubase creates. There is a secondary value called intensity. Think of threshold like an instantaneous moment in time. The transient at the beginning of the audio is, generally speaking, the loudest point. That's the most important thing to identify hit points with. Intensity, think of it more of like an area-based concept. How substantial, how big is that sound? And in terms of that, Cubase is doing more of a calculation, a time-based calculation. Threshold is much the more important of them, and for today's purposes we're not going to worry about intensity at all. It's by far secondary to threshold. So now that I've introduced that threshold value, I've got the hit point where I want it to be on the size of that. That's probably the quietest transient in the entire solo, and so I've set my threshold down to that. Ultimately, we're going to be creating audio warp markers, but just before we do that, and while we're stuck in this hit points view, let's press quantize now and see what happens. I've just noticed I've got a little bit of rough quantizing. I don't want to deal with that today. We're just going to go to straight 16ths and then press Q. Rough allows you to add a little bit of kind of randomness to your quantization. We're not going to do that. So there's me quantizing to 16ths, and it's been based entirely on the hit points. If those hit points aren't accurate, the quantizing isn't going to be accurate either. If I zoom into one of these little moments, these stop moments, you can see that really the transient is where my cursor is currently highlighted, and so this hit point is very slightly wrong, but it's an excellent approximation. I'm just going to undo that quantizing, get the audio back to its original state. So this is something to be aware of, that this concept of hit points lies underneath everything. This is the architectural foundation of how Cubase does its audio timing correction. You could quite easily spend your entire life in Cubase and pretty much never go into the hit point screen. It is actually a relatively advanced operation, and for the most part it can be pretty much ignored. If we close that window down, Cubase is still going to let us do all of our quantizing. All of those hit point markers have disappeared, but they are still there. Let's prove that. I'll press Q again, and there's the quantization being performed, and undo it. Now, quantization doesn't have to be such a blunt tool. Rather than quantizing the entire event in one go, which is a bit brutal and generally something that I wouldn't bother with, you can select areas of the audio and just quantize that. So if for instance, I pick this region of audio, then you're always going to get a little bit of leading and trailing correction applied to it. But if we have a look at this transient way over here, that's going to get left completely alone. The quantization is going to run up to hit points kind of within the range of my selected zone. So we're basically looking at probably that and somewhere around here. Let's see what happens when I press Q. Yep, so it's completely leaving these transients alone. They're way outside the hit point range. But this little bit of audio just to the left has been caught, and similarly with the area just to the right of the region. So it's not an exclusive region, it's all of the hit points contained within that region. Let's have a look at the hit point view just to clarify that. And now you can see exactly what's happening really clearly. This hit point zone extends all the way up to this line that I'm drawing with my mouse, and that's what's being quantized. That's the advantage of knowing what's going on under the hood. These kind of strangely mysterious, hang on a minute, what's going on here moments suddenly become far clearer when you understand it's all hanging off hit points. Furthermore, we don't have to quantize exactly to the beat in exactly the same way as when we're looking at quantizing MIDI, and I've done a basic guide to quantizing in MIDI. I'll put a link to that above and in the description. Here we're quantizing audio, but exactly the same principles apply. So if we engage soft quantize, which is this little feature with the two angle brackets, the slash, now when I perform quantize, I'm still operating on the range, but it's not going to get quite all of the way to the 16th. Here we go. So you can see the transient. Let's have a look at the hit points. There's the transient, and it's moved closer towards 114.3, but it hasn't actually got there. Okay, so we've had a look at the concept of hit points, which allow us to perform temporal manipulation, quantizing that allows us to perform automated operations on the event in large scale. What about manual editing of every single one of those hit point markers? We accomplish that using a tool called AudioWarp. AudioWarp hangs off hit points. It uses those hit points to determine where these timing anchors are going to be. Let's have a look at the AudioWarp tool before we go any further. When we click in the section, it looks very uninteresting. There's actually nothing going on there at all. Today we're going to be performing manual manipulation of AudioWarp, and we use the free warp tool for that. If we engage free warp, again, there's absolutely nothing there to indicate that there's anything good to go. There's no information for us telling us where Cubase thinks those hit point markers are. Now, you've got multiple ways to approach this problem. You could do the entire thing manually. That's the position that we're currently looking at right now. Let's have a look what happens if I press Q. Suddenly, a whole host of brand new information appears in the AudioWarp screen. In order to quantize, Cubase needed to generate some markers using those hit points in order that it could manipulate the audio to move the transients, to move the beginning of each audio event closer to the timing marker. That entire process wasn't AudioWarp. It was just performed automatically. And so when we're looking at the AudioWarp screen and we execute a quantize, all of these warp markers, this is what these orange lines are called, they all suddenly spring into being, and you can see these very small orange numbers at the top of the screen. That's telling you whether or not the event has been stretched, if it's bigger than 1, or compressed, if it's less than 1. You can actually see what Cubase is doing on every single one of these hit point zones. If I undo that quantize, the warp markers disappear again. I've no longer performed any timing correction, so I don't need the warp markers. We can actually create those warp markers manually. Head back over to the hit points section, and I can manually generate warp markers by clicking the warp markers button. There's no visible evidence in the hit point screen that anything's happened, but if we jump back to the AudioWarp screen, there they all are. So there's a couple of ways that you can get to the point where all of these warp markers are generated for you. And generally speaking, Cubase is going to do a very good job at interpreting where the beginnings of those notes are. Let's re-engage free warp. And so now we're able to manipulate each one of these warp markers. Let's see what we can do with them. By default, when you enter free warp mode, if you hover in the lower window, you can see the two arrows with the little clock symbol. That's telling you that the cursor is now in sizing mode. In other words, if I pick one of these warp markers up, you can see as I hover over it, it turns kind of a grey-white. If I pick that thing up now and drag it, I'm manipulating that warp marker, and you can see what's happening to the audio to the left and right of it. The audio is being compressed or expanded up to the adjacent warp markers on either side. So I can snap that fairly close to the beat, and that note is now kind of more accurate to the timing. This idea of warping to the left and right of our currently selected zone is really important. If I undo some of those steps and get back to the point where we have no warp markers, I'm going to manually create one warp marker now. I'm going to zoom in nice and tight so we can see really clearly what's going on. And I'm going to click where the transient quite clearly visibly begins. So I've just created a manual warp marker. Watch what happens. I'll just zoom out a little bit. To the audio in both directions when I move this warp marker. Everything stretches and compresses. This is the only warp marker that exists in the audio, and so everything is being stretched to the left and right. It's highly unlikely that I want to manipulate the entire solo by this single warp marker. So let's undo that. So it's really important that if you're going to perform audio warp marking, you very carefully constrain the zone over which that audio warp that audio warping is allowed to execute. So generally speaking, what you'll do is you'll always make sure that you have a warp marker defined before and after the area that you're going to manipulate. And now you've defined constraints, and that's the only thing that audio can actually warp to. There are a couple of options in the AudioWarp toolbar that we need to pay attention to that are very important. One that I have engaged literally all the time is snap to zero crossing. And what this basically means is that any warp marker that I create or any manipulation that I perform upon these markers is always going to snap to zero crossing. Now as I move my tool, can you see that little white marker on my tool? It's snapping to all the zero crossing points. I disable snap to zero crossing. It will let me create the warp markers anywhere I want. The second thing that I'll typically do is ensure that snap is off. You can see that it actually is. That means when I pick up these warp markers, I'm moving very, very smoothly, as opposed to engaging snap. When I've got less fine control, it's still pretty fine control actually, truth be told, but you can see that as I approach the 16th lines, it's snapping to them. Well, I don't want it to do that. I want complete control of where these transients are going to be. I'm going to be doing a very kind of musical thing. I don't want everything to snap exactly to the lines. So those two functions are pretty important. All right, then let's do some editing on this audio. And this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to use my project view at the top to specify the cycle range over which I'm operating. The reason for doing that is that I can leave grid enabled and I can work in strict 3-bar sections. Down below, however, I have snap disengaged. If I try to manipulate the cycle locators inside my audio window, they're not going to work properly because snap's off. Let's let Cubase do some of the heavy lifting for us and we'll regenerate our warp markers. Head back up to AudioWarp and there they all are. We're not required to use them all. We've still got complete manual control of them all, as you'll see in this demo today, but it's a good starting point. So let's have a listen to it and see what we can do. Okay, so these two audio events at 110.4 and 11 are a little bit too lazy. Let's pull them in a little bit. Are the warp markers correct? Yeah, I'm pretty happy that Cubase has correctly identified those. We don't need to do anything to them. And because we have warp markers on either side, I'm happy to leave those be as well. I'm not going to make these tiny adjustments. This is one of those situations where you use your judgment how much difference that you want to make to this to the audio. As I say, when I originally released this thing, I left it completely alone, and that's fine. Just doing a little bit of manual correction today. Okie dokie. That first bar between 110 and 111 is now fixed. I move the project along by 1 bar, reselect my lower editor, zoom to locators again. Now I'm going to move forwards 1 bar at a time, just correcting this solo. I'm always doing a cycle bigger than the zone that I'm really interested in. So mostly I'm interested in the middle of these 3 bars, but I am processing the whole thing all in one go. Is this one a little bit previous? Yeah, let's drag that forwards a tiny bit. And again, because I've got warp markers on both sides, I can comfortably do that, and I know that I'm not really breaking anything. That's fine. So let's use Quantization to fix these, just to demo the fact that we've got multiple different tools available to us. I'm going to right click in the editor to bring me back to region selection mode. So now my cursor changes to a region tool, and I'm going to pick these 3 events. So I'm basically going to quantize everything inside this rectangle that I'm drawing with my mouse. Soft quantize is still enabled, so they're not going to go all of the way to the beat. I'm just going to move part of the way there. I can press Q, and now I've fixed all 3 events simultaneously. Let's have a listen to it. Okay, I don't like this event at the end, that's too late. So I re-engage free warp and then drag that forwards a little bit. Happy with those 3 bars. Move the song on by 1 bar, and now I've got a different perspective. Okay, now I know that I'm coming up to a lot of work that I have to do on those. I call them chug-a-lugs, the chugga-chugga-chugga. So I'm actually going to move it forward another bar, because this is the stuff that we're really interested in now. Okay, this is probably like the worst played note of the piece. And if I hadn't been too lazy to actually do any audio warping on this piece, I definitely would have fixed that. But let's do the chug-a-lugs as well. If we control click and zoom in, we can see that the hit points aren't quite where I think they should be. So this hit point here, and we saw this in the previous screen, but I'm going to fix it now. I'm going to delete this warp marker and reassign it manually. In order to do that, I'm going to press Alt on my keyboard. And in doing so, we now get the eraser tool, hover over the warp marker and delete it. Now I'm going to recreate the warp marker where I want it to be. Having done that, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and let's just concentrate on this area so that we make sure that we don't break anything. I'm going to pick all of those notes and press Q. So I've just quantized the stuff that I'm forensically examining at this moment. So listen to that. Much better, much better. Has it brought this one in far enough? You know, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to leave that alone because it did sound good then. Engage free warp again because I want to change this audio warp marker. It's not quite where I think the transient is. I think the transient is there. And could you see that when I deleted that warp marker, everything on both sides auto-corrected because now Cubase has no timing information for that segment of music. Let's put the marker there. And then we'll keep the lazy feel and just drag it forwards manually. Perfectly happy with that one. And I'll do that manually while I'm here. Same for this one, a tiny bit. And now all those 3 bars together. Great. So because I'm happy with the entire thing, I can jump forwards 2 bars this time. Click in my lower window, zoom to locators. I'm going to make another quick manual change actually. I know full well that this is a very long held note. Don't need to hear it again. Let's just jump over that completely unnecessary bar. Okay, so it's quite clear that I'm being too anxious to get into this note here. Whilst I'm zoomed out at this view, I'm just going to do that manually. Give that a quick listen. Happy with all that. Move it forwards by 2 bars. Click in the lower zone, zoom to locators. Now this bit's going to be a bit of a challenge for us because these chunks are 2 notes. So I need to be careful doing any timing correction on them because there are notes inside that no transient detection is going to find. Because they were gentle hammer-ons, if you zoom in far enough though, you can quite clearly see the different frequency of the notes that are being played. This is the beauty of being able to zoom in this accurately. You're not going to catch it with a hit point detector, but you are going to catch it with your eyes. It's really obvious where that note starts. And so you can add manual warp markers. They're going to help you to identify these sections of the song that are going to be otherwise really difficult to perform any timing correction on. Let's just see if that's all of them. An extra note there. And there's another one. That was a 1, 2, 3, wasn't it? Zoom to locators again. Now that we've generated all that note definition for it, let's just give Cubase a go at quantizing that entire thing rather than doing it manually. Right-click in the editor, select inside the hit point range or the warp range in which I want to operate, and let's just press Q. It might work, who knows? Yeah, it did. It did. I didn't get this far when I was prepping for the video, so that was a bit of a leap of faith. Could I have gone in and edited these transients to the point where they were absolutely on the money? Yeah, but I want the entire thing to have a fairly lazy feel anyway, so I'm fairly comfortable with how that sounds. And this entire phrase at the end of the solo, so we're heading towards the end of the solo now, there's not much more to be done. Visually looks pretty good. I'm going to have a quick zoom in to see whether or not I agree with Cubase as to where it's placed its AudioWarp markers, and for the most part, I'm pretty happy with them. Maybe this phrase I want to individually create separate markers for, because I'm going to press quantize and I don't want it to break anything. I don't want Cubase to get too carried away moving this stuff too far, when for the most part it wants to be on these 16th lines. Okay, and now we're going to do a pretty brutal select all and cue. Soft quantize all the time. I would never dream of doing this stuff without soft quantizing being engaged, but I'm just nudging them closer to where the beat lines should be, having manually identified that all of those warp markers are correct. Just let it run. I'm perfectly happy with that. And that's the job done. That solo is now better than it was 2 weeks ago when I released this piece of music. Oops. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.